Let's get underway. We will first hear from Nancy Gibbs, who is the director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And she will make some introductory remarks to kind of frame the discussion about the challenges of climate journalism and how journalism is rising to that task. Then we'll hear from Andrew McCormick. He's with Covering Climate Now, an initiative out of Columbia University and the Columbia Journalism School and others. He'll tell us all about that. And then we'll hear from Amrita Gupta about the Earth Journalism Network. And then we'll have a final bit of discussion, and then we'll break. So, Nancy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I speak very much not as a climate journalist or as any kind of a expert in the topic, but as a former editor and now professor trying to understand our attention economy and how to break through to audiences with more opportunities than ever before to ignore what we have to say. If you doubt that, you should take a look at the traffic to everything from ABC News to the New York Times to CNN to Fox News in like the 6 months before the 2020 election and the 6 months after. New York Times down 33%, ABC 55%, Fox 26%, CNN 20%, which you can attribute to a lot of things, but the fact that we were tired of having to follow every test positivity up and down in our communities, God knows tired of a completely exhausting campaign and insurrection, that when we think about all of the challenges that newsrooms are facing, including the challenge of a polarized audience and an audience that is polarized around issues like climate, I would argue that it may be that the polarization that matters most is between the engaged and the disengaged. So it's always been a challenge for reporters to try to cover this topic responsibly to general audiences. If you have the good fortune of having an expert and narrowcast audience that is every bit as passionate, interested, informed, on top of the topic as you are, God bless. That's a great thing. But how do you get normal people to read, watch, follow, care, while resisting the temptation to sensationalize, capturing both what's known and not known or knowable at this moment, and making it feel relevant to people who are preoccupied with gas prices? I think as expert climate journalists, you are critically important to the broader framing of the debate. And the reason for that is because as news deserts open up all over the country, as we are losing more and more newspapers in more and more communities, as hedge funds are hollowing out those newspapers and local news sources that remain, it means that a typical journalist is having to cover the cops on Monday and the school board on Tuesday and a zoning commission on Wednesday and a shooting on Thursday. And if they need to understand or write about anything having to do with environment or land or climate or its impact on that community, they don't have time to become experts. And so they are naturally going to look to you to make them smarter. And so I think that you as teachers of other journalists, of journalists who don't have the luxury to go deep, is a critically important function. This is something we try to do at the Shorenstein Center with our Journalists Resource Project, which takes peer-reviewed academic literature and tries to translate it, make it accessible to journalists who just don't have time to read 10 peer-reviewed studies. But essentially, you are also that filter. And so when the ecosystem, the environment that I pay the most attention to is our information environment. It is suffering from all kinds of toxic pollutants, as you well know. And the health of that ecosystem, I think, is critically important to the health of society and democracy generally. And so when it comes to this topic, the role that you play, I think, is enormously important. One of the big challenges I think you are up against is a perception gap. Some of you, I am sure, have editors and colleagues who are 1,000% behind your work, and you don't have to work hard to sell them on why a story is interesting and important. Others of you may find that you're competing for space and resources with colleagues covering other beats. And that reflects, I think, a widespread misunderstanding about how much the mass audience cares about this topic. This is a more insidious heir to the both sides problem. I think we can say and stipulate that the science is settled, but the salience isn't. So if you look at the latest Gallup polls about what issues people care most about, or the Harvard-Harris poll that was out this morning, it's inflation, it's the economy. Go down, 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 down before you get immigration, COVID, racism, healthcare, before you get to environment and climate, which gives a reluctant editor an excuse to push back against ideas. So here's the ammunition. Any of you as freelancers who run into this, or if you work for newsrooms where you feel like you are having to fight for space, as opposed to those of you who have the good fortune that it is a given, the urgency and the importance is a given. I would point to you to some really interesting research that has tried to capture the misperception around climate. So a group called Populous, some of you may know them, did something called the American Aspirations Index. And they took 55 things that people could choose as being priorities: the quality of education, crime, immigration, healthcare. And they asked people not just to rank order what their priorities were for the country, what they thought the most important issues were, but to also rank what they thought the public generally thought was most important. Climate, out of 55, came in at number 3. When people were asked, and where do you think it ranks as a broader societal concern? 33. It isn't that people don't think climate matters, it's that they don't think other people think it matters. And that, if there is a way to be closing that kind of a gap, you have an enormous head start in first winning over your editors and then winning over your audiences. The second challenge, let's say you get past that perception challenge, is the polarization challenge that I mentioned. And it's easy for us as educators and communicators to think this is just a matter of giving people better information. This is a natural default. It's scientific literacy. It's give people the facts. Unfortunately, some of you have probably followed Dan Kahan's work at Yale Law School, and he found actually, that's not the problem. In fact, that's kind of the opposite of the problem. And what his research found was that the public divisions over climate reflect this incredible conflict of interest between people's personal interest in remaining in good standing with their friends, family, and political tribe, versus their collective interest in the health of the environment. And it turns out that it isn't that we just need for people to be more rational. It's actually people being rational that makes large numbers of them reject climate science. And in fact, the smarter and more educated, the better they are at coming up for reasons to reject it. And the example he uses is a rural barber in South Carolina who wants to put a petition in his window for people to sign to argue that Congress should pass more funding for environmental sustainability and climate mitigation. And that if he does that, the odds are that he is going to lose his job as a local congressman, Bob Inglis in South Carolina, did when he's a Republican, he rejected climate denialism and ended up being primaried out of his office. That actually the immediate interest in your family and your community and your political tribe may actually make people much less likely to have any willingness. The cost is too high. Because if they feel there's nothing I can individually do about the climate, But there's a lot that can happen to me that would be bad if I came out as one of those green people. So the polarization challenge, along with the perception challenge, makes what you're doing really hard. It also, of course, and I will leave it at this because I'm really eager to hear how Andrea and Amrita go about doing this, is it gives you a real framing opportunity. Because if you feel in something you're writing or the audience that you're trying to reach that you are running into any of these obstacles of either political antipathy or misunderstanding, the opportunity to frame issues that are actually about the environment, but you are framing it in Iowa, you're framing it around agriculture, and in California around wildfires, and in Arizona around water, and in Florida around sea levels and property values. There are lots of ways of framing, and I think as we were just reminded with the example of the willow, you can frame things around wonder, around the extraordinary opportunities that invention and science and innovation is bringing, exactly because this issue is so urgent. This doesn't have to be, here are all the things that are bad and dangerous. I think people's appetite for wonder and for hope and for things that are working, and for being reminded of just the power of intellect to solve problems. I think there is audiences for that, even in communities and environments that do not think of themselves as people who are going to follow this topic really closely. So as much as there are challenges that on all the research makes it clear that what you're trying to do is hard, there is also, I think, an enormous amount of opportunity to break through to people in ways that are very powerful. So Andrew, I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Well, I can speak to some of that, but hopefully we can get into more of the specifics in Q&A. So my name's Andrew McCormick. I am the Deputy Director of Covering Climate Now, which is a nonprofit journalism collaborative. I'm also a freelancer. The story of Covering Climate Now really starts with just the media's handling of climate in general. As many in this room will know and attest, for a really long time, the media was in general silent on climate. There were a lot of great climate journalists out there, and that probably included many of the people in this room who were doing exceptional work. But by and large, climate was just not a topic that we were seeing in headlines, and it wasn't something that was center or often even peripheral to the news cycle. So in 2019, this is in the lead up to the UN General Assembly in September of that year, where Greta Thunberg famously kind of like excoriated the world leaders that were there. Columbia Journalism Review, The Nation magazine, and The Guardian got together to form this nonprofit, which the goal was essentially going to be to encourage more and better coverage of the climate story. We came together with that goal. It was kind of a vague goal in mind, and we decided we were going to do it as a partnership, and we wanted to reach out to a bunch of other news organizations to see who would join us. Put out that call. I think that we expected maybe like a few dozen partners maybe to trickle in, and to have to kind of go banging on doors to get people to join us. But instead, to our surprise, we got like a deluge of hundreds of people saying we'll join like very quickly and immediately. And not just kind of small organizations or freelancers here and there, but like large news organizations coming to us and saying, we want to be part of this. So what that said to us was not that journalists were out there thinking necessarily like, oh, we shouldn't be covering the climate story. It's maybe that there was just not really this sense of collective purpose or momentum. And I think that as an organization, we tried to provide that. So working with a lot of those journalists that came to us, we put together best practices, put together some pitfalls to avoid in climate coverage, built out resources on various topic areas that the climate story intersects with, stuff like solution, justice, food, various other issues. Kind of pushed all of this out to journalists and said, hey, just please keep this in mind as you go forth and do your work. Another thing that we did in that year, this was right around the UN General Assembly, was we were thinking about the problem that Nancy was discussing about how do you deal with how do you deal with the attention economy? How do you deal with the distraction that people face in general, and then also just the noise that exists in the news cycle? How do you help climate to really break through and be seen by audiences? And so we came up with an idea of doing a concentrated week of coverage where we picked one week in the lead up to the General Assembly and said, what if all of us committed to significantly boosting coverage of the climate story during this week? What if we all agreed to put it at the top of our homepages? We all agreed to run much more stories on climate than we typically do. And the hope was that if we do that, there will be if we all do that, if hundreds of news organizations that had become our partners do that at the same time, that there will be kind of a, I don't know, kind of a mounting effect that does find a way of breaking through what people are seeing in their Twitter, Facebook feeds. I think that at that time, I mean, it's hard to gauge exactly, but I think that we were really effective, and I think that a lot of folks had fun doing it. One of the cool things that we did during that was a lot of the organizations that were involved, including a lot of the very large, big-name publications, made all of their climate coverage that week available for free to reuse by other publications in the partnership. And the reason for that is, as we were discussing, that a lot of news organizations are just too stretched thin between all the various issues that they have to cover. So the idea was maybe a news organization out there wants to cover this issue well, but just doesn't have the resources or the manpower to do it themselves. And the idea was that through this partnership, they would have, they would have stories to run. And that was without license. It was without any exchange of money or anything like that. I think that the idea and the kind of rallying cry was that the story is more important than how we conduct business as usual in this industry. Like, competition around this issue shouldn't matter as much as just telling the story right. So since that time, since 2019, obviously I think we've seen major changes in the industry, and much for the better around climate coverage. I don't think that Covering Climate Now claims any responsibility for that, but I do hope that we were kind of an agent of change. So we've seen a lot of organizations adding climate desks, building out climate verticals, launching their own climate-specific publications, like Bloomberg Green, for instance. Organizations from the Washington Post, CNN, ABC, a whole lot of others have very largely built out the climate desks that they have, or the climate teams they have. People are hiring for climate, and that's great. So as the industry has changed, I think a little bit of how we approach our mission of promoting more and better climate coverage, I think how we approach that has changed also. So these days we're doing a lot of events. These are panel discussions, essentially, that we call Talking Shop, that are, quote, kind of by journalists and for journalists. So we'll convene a few journalists, usually kind of senior folks who've been on the beat for a while, who know an issue really well, convene a few experts, and just host a discussion of, like, what are the kind of challenges that we face in covering this issue? What are some opportunities what are opportunities for journalists covering this issue? What are some story ideas? And what we hope, typically we have several hundred, I think, journalists attending most of these events. What we hope is that people will kind of attend, they'll feel kind of a sense of camaraderie, they'll find something in that session to take away and apply to their own work. We also sometimes convene several outlets within the partnership to come together and cover specific areas that we think are deserving of, kind of elevated attention. Something like climate migration, for instance. Right now we're working with several outlets on a climate and democracy project that kind of comes from this question of, can we diffuse the climate emergency without first addressing the democracy crisis that is plaguing a lot of the country? And what we hope to come away from a lot of this country and a lot of the world. What we hope to come away from these types of things with is a body of work that we can present, to audiences, certainly, but also to other journalists, to say, hey, here's a lot of work that's being done on climate and democracy or climate and migration. Please take inspiration from this, and please find ways to maybe cover this from your own corner of the industry for your own audience. We also last year instituted a new Climate Journalism Award, which just did climate awards. We're doing that again this year to celebrate and uplift excellent coverage that's being done. I think on the whole, what we really want to do is provide kind of a sense of community around climate coverage. I think that we heard from a lot of the journalists that we talk with that covering climate can be an often lonely task, can be sometimes disheartening task. So I think that we just want to be a place online, a place in our events, I mean, not everybody needs more Slack in their life, but we have a separate like Slack channel that folks from a lot of different publications are just tuned into, and they just chat and brainstorm ideas. I think that we just want to be a place where people can come together and find other people who are grappling with the same issues that they are, kind of feel supported by that, feel a little bit emboldened by it, and we hope that that has a positive effect on their work. I think something that I'll add is that it's not usually the people in this room, right, that are not quite getting the climate story. It's the climate journalists who are already doing a very excellent job covering climate. What is more often the problem is that other people in the newsroom aren't taking it upon themselves to care about climate or to make it their problem. So I think that, especially lately, when we're in conversations with newsroom leaders, with editors, a lot of what we're talking about is not how to improve their climate coverage, because their climate coverage is usually already very good. It's about how to make sure that climate is an issue that's being taken up on every beat. How do we get politics reporters, business reporters, sports reporters also smart about climate so that they're making appropriate mention of it in their stories? And that doesn't mean, obviously, that climate has to be the main point of their stories. It just means that when there's an opportunity to make reference to it, to make factual reference to it, that opportunity should almost always be exercised. And I think that, obviously it's a very fast-paced industry. There's not a whole lot of time when you're jamming out a story to kind of say, like, wait, have I thought about climate? But the answer is sometimes only one sentence. And I think that our goal is to say, to the extent that this is a team effort, to the extent that we don't just need reporters and writers thinking about this, we need, or presenters or whatever the case for video and audio. It's not just those people that need to be thinking about it. It's their editors, it's their producers, it's the people who do the push notifications, it's the headline writers. I think that we're kind of in a moment where there's so much disinformation out there, misinformation out there regarding climate that can be, unfortunately, kind of forwarded by some of the bad habits of journalism, like both sidesism. So I think that to the extent that we can do better and be a part of the solution to climate change as journalists, it's something that everybody in the newsroom needs to be thinking about. So that's what we do. That's the kind of general overview. I think there are a lot of specifics to get into about like what constitutes good climate coverage, or what are some of the things that we especially try to encourage or avoid. That can probably come up in Q&A, and I will hand it over to Amrita from the Earth Journalism Network.
Thank you. Okay, I have a few slides, but I will try and be brief. Okay. So I'm the editor and content officer at EJN, which is short for Earth Journalism Network. And so we are not a media outlet. We're a media development nonprofit, and we've been around since about 2004. And so we're a network of about 15,000 journalists worldwide. And we also support that network building piece. So I'm actually finding it a little hard to read, so I'm going to turn this way. So one of the key things that we do is we help establish networks in low and middle income countries where climate journalism and environmental journalism sort of gets outcompeted all the time by competing interests in the news cycle, unless there's like a natural disaster or something like this, or so here to make it like something that's sustained, I think we work with Society of Indonesian Environmental Journalists, and there's this list. You'll see some members right here in this room who are part of these networks as well. And so we, the way that we support networks is both through supporting individual journalists who might be freelancers or on staff, and media outlets as well. So some of the ways that we do this, so the part that I'm most involved in is the story grants to journalists, which is a small grant through a particular project to support more reporting, to increase the sort of quality and quantity of environmental and climate coverage. And so through that process, a journalist also gets to work with a mentor that we assign them to. Might be an expert in that region, or might be a veteran journalist, and sort of work for many months on that particular story, which is not a luxury that many journalists have. And then there's this other piece of sort of working with editors, having some sensitization trainings, explaining why the journalism sort of what's the headline doesn't always have to run with politics or sport or those kind of pieces. And then so the media workshops, here you'll see from the pictures, the right picture is a media workshop that we just recently did in East Africa, sort of helping journalists unpack that scientific connections and being able to talk about climate without feeling intimidated when they don't have a science background. How do you piece through thousands of pages of the IPCC report, right? Or supporting journalists to go to the COP in November. So we supported 22 journalists from low and middle income countries to actually go and report for their local audiences what's happening at these climate summits that affects everybody, but often they're being told the Western perspective of it, So there's this training, capacity building, sort of, I guess, community building piece that you spoke to that we're really trying to work towards. Yeah, and also resources. So we try and produce resources that are, lately, the last few years, because of COVID, a lot of the workshops have had to pivot to webinars, which have been focused on particular topics. This recent one on green recovery, unpacking, it could be a data recipe that it helps journalists sort of use data visualization and mapping and these kind of tools to talk about the climate and environmental story. It could be an online course that takes about 8 hours, but you can do it at your own time. It could be a tip sheet. The one that we're working on right now is less to do with land, but IUU fishing and sort of how journalists can cover that story, which is very underreported. So this is something that we try and make free and accessible and really hear from the network what pieces are missing that we could try and speak to, sort of bringing in experts from different regions to speak to these thematic sort of areas. And I want to sort of, that leads me to sort of some of the projects that we work on that actually really focus on this land and climate connection. We wrapped up a 4-year project on the Bay of Bengal, and so many stories from outlets there. We actually tracked their increase in reporting on migration, the impacts on health and women because of salt water in their diets, and their managed retreat, which was not something that was being talked about. We have a similar project in the Pacific Islands. Well, all of these sort of frontline communities often don't have their voices amplified by local reporters, and so it's really trying to support local reporters to report in local media, local languages on these issues that impact them. So it could be a project on green recovery, talking about accountability, holding governments accountable. The indigenous projects that we do are supporting indigenous journalists with sort of funds and mentorship to report on what's impacting their indigenous territories or their peoples. And we're finding, in fact, that the electric vehicle thing that came up earlier today, there's a lot of mining of nickel happening in Indonesia, where indigenous communities are feeling like this is a benefit for the planet for everyone else, but not, it's taking a toll on us. So I think unpacking that nuance and actually supporting journalists to be their own spokespeople for their community is what we try and do with these sort of thematic projects, which can run from a year to 4 years to sort of, as long as we get them funded, of course, which is the other problem. Okay, so one thing we really try and do is we use this monitoring and evaluation methodology, and I won't go into the geekiness of it, but why it's an important piece is because if you can show that journalism does make an impact on the ground, that there is policy change, there is behavior change, there is an investigation into this, contaminated water or something like this. If you can actually show that in that landscape a story can help make a difference, then there is more an incentive for an editor or a outlet to support that kind of reporting. And so that's a big part of what we try and do, is to sort of highlight how environmental coverage, climate coverage can make an impact. Okay, talking about geojournalism and partner websites. So I think Earth Journalism Network really tries to support, you'll see here there's partner websites that focus on reporting issues on the Nile Basin or the Mekong Basin, the sort of third pole, which talks about the Himalayan region. There's these platforms that work as curating news from this region and producing original stories from these regions. And so a lot of the support that we provide them in the initial years is also how to help visualize these stories, how to equip journalists with the tools that they need to use GIS and mapping and things that can be daunting when you don't have that newsroom support, or if you're a freelancer who hasn't been trained in these kind of sort of ways to tell your story better. Yes, okay, so back to that collaboration point. I think especially with sort of shrinking resources, newsrooms in competition with each other versus being in cooperation with each other is not sort of serving anybody, and that's something we strongly believe, is if we can try and help foster outlets from a different sort of outlets to sort of work together who wouldn't typically learn from each other and share their resources or share sort of ideas. And so the Earth Journalism Network tries to sort of support these project-based collaborations, I will say, that run for like many months. One that we've recently launched is about, and it's going to be contentious, I know, because it's about meat production and sort of, animal protein. So it could be aquaculture, it could be, dairy across the Asia Pacific, and how that impacts One Health. So, risk of zoonotic diseases or antimicrobial resistance. So having outlets from Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Fiji sort of report on this and sort of share strategies, solutions, challenges. I think that's a piece that we're trying to be that platform where they can come together and work together on these things where they wouldn't typically otherwise do. And then a few other examples here. There was one that was looking at investigating fossil fuel financing across Asia, algal blooms caused by sort of, what was happening in the Amazon basin. So that's a little bit about that. And then here's just a point that we can also collaborate in more informal ways, right? Yes, floodlights on there. So I think the Earth Journalism Network really values even one-time collaboration with other sort of outlets, with other sort of foundations, nonprofits, and helps that entire network of 14,000, 15,000 journalists reach these opportunities where they can contribute to a New York Times special project, where we can reach out and say, build those connections, where we have a journalist reporting on East Africa crude oil pipeline actually getting published by The Guardian because we can facilitate those connections. So it's not just to say that there's validation because it's an international media outlet. I think that the main point is still that we need to strengthen local and regional media, but it's good to be able to collaborate even on one-off, instances. I don't know whether I should move to the next few slides because this is sort of a response to the question, but I'll try and be quick. About a question that I think Anthony posed to us when we were supposed to think about what we wanted to say was, will climate desks be a fixture? Should they be? I think that media does need climate correspondence, and we see that as just as people have pointed out in this room, everybody has to sort of think of themselves in a way as a climate journalist, whatever their beat is. I think one thing that I would flag is that there's a danger, I guess, of siloization or having climate sort of relegated, like the back pages, how environment sort of journalism was when I started out. It was just, you had to find it. So that's something that I'd flag as, especially for the non-mainstream outlets, say, oh, okay, I have my climate page, but where is it, So that is something that I think we should be careful about. Yeah, and to the challenges in sort of doing justice to the climate story. Again, much of this was brought up in all of the previous sessions, but I'll try and point out a few. How do we sort of try and get reporting be sustained and consistent and not just after an event? That is something that we're struggling with. And how do we report on, as Nancy said, things that are still unknown, things that are still being sort of, the science is happening every day and the changes are sometimes incremental. So that is not like sometimes a sexy story, right? But it's an important story. And having to do that work to work with outlets and audiences and things like this to show why that's still important. I think that's something that is a big challenge at the forefront of our work. Being able to unpack all of that jargon and all of that sort of doomsday sort of tone that we're sort of struggling with, right? There's fatigue about it. And it's almost like, well, if we can't do anything about it, then why do I need to read about it? Versus sort of really looking at trying to show resilience, innovation, what's happening on the ground. There's so many solutions. There's community-led efforts. There are actually indigenous groups sort of reclaiming their power towards stewardship and things like this. So can we also tell those stories? That is something we try and encourage. And also, can these stories be told in local media, in different platforms, in community radio, sometimes theater, which happens with traveling journalist groups in East Africa or something I didn't know. Can it be told not for people, but from the people? I think that's something that we're trying to encourage, and that's it. Yeah.
Something I'll bring up on this question of siloization. Kind of a funny, but also a sort of disheartening story. I mentioned that I'm also a freelancer in addition to my work with Covering Climate Now. And something that I found pretty fascinating working with one outlet that I quite enjoy working with was I had written a piece, and it was a climate-focused piece about a certain state's politics. And it was a lot of science and a lot of politics. And I was working with the science editor at this publication. And he got it, he edited it, and then he said, hey, I actually don't know if I'm able to run this story. I need to check with the politics team because they're supposed to work on politics stories. Right. And had to go to that person. Then I had to get re-edited by a different editor. And it just kind of fascinated me that there was this kind of question of who's allowed to edit climate. And I just found that really interesting. So to this question of will climate desks be permanent, I think that I think there's absolutely a need for in organizations that can afford to have entire climate teams. I think those need to stay in existence because I think there's obviously, as with any issue, benefit that comes from a group of people specializing and working together on an issue. But at the same time, I think it should be incumbent on every other desk in the newsroom, not just to broadly, vaguely learn about climate, but for one or two people on that team to kind of work themselves up as climate specialists. Because when you think about an IPCC report release or something, that's something that usually the climate reporter is going to handle. But there's something a little bit wonky when we don't think of that as a world story, right? When there's a global desk that doesn't cover that, but the climate desk does. I think that newsrooms tackling these questions from multiple angles, and I think that's kind of a part of the answer.